So I'm going to talk about vanilla components, okay? In that, so component versus framework. And the reason I say vanilla components is, I mean, traditionally we called them web components, or that was a term that we used. Polymer was a good example of that type of web component library. But there is a new term coming, uh, like official web components from like W3, the Worldwide Consortium Group, and the people in charge of JavaScript and cascading style sheets. So it's a term that might get stolen or repurposed in that. And so what is a component when you run into it? So I got this component versus framework thing. And then it gets confused with framework of components or components that work with frameworks. So for us right now, so that we can understand the bits and pieces, what do the components deal with? They deal with look and feel. So it's definitely front facing. The user is interacting with them directly in that. So often the cascading style sheet thing, colors, corners, positioning, grids, flexbox, that sort of stuff. Um, you could reskin existing HTML controls. So you see this a lot, like every component library I go to, not everyone, but all the ones I go to, there's usually a section where they have form components. So what it would be the standard HTML checkboxes, radio buttons, select in that, restyled. So you definitely see that in standard, angle bracket form, angle bracket inputs and stuff. That there's a whole series usually in these bigger libraries that deal with just restyling those existing HTML components. So there is something, called a form in HTML. There's something called, a text input and that sort of stuff. And they build some reskinning or styling around it, right? So there's an existing element that they're tweaking in that. And definitely form controls is where you find it. And then they add new elements. So you don't get an official angle bracket element name angle bracket, but there's this new thing you see in the component library. Maybe it's called application bar, or maybe it's called accordion, right? Or maybe it's called sidebar or side menu. Now, are you going to find an angle bracket side menu, right? No, but there's something called angle bracket nav. So the idea is you create these new things. So in the component library, they have really fancy names, spark lines or something like that. And you go, I don't remember anything be called spark lines in HTML, probably because there's not in that. But you take an existing tag and repurpose it via cascading style sheets and that. So you add new elements by extending existing ones typically. It's a great object-oriented technique is we have these existing objects and we extend them and that. And it gets into these inheritance concepts and programming and stuff. But we can take an existing thing like a div or a ordered list maybe, or the canvas, and create it and turn it into a chart, right? That sort of thing. So we take these existing elements and extend them, and therefore it looks like when you look at the component library, there are these new things that didn't exist in HTML before, in that. So that's, but very much, it's another way to look at components is the thing that the person clicks on, swipes on, chooses something out of. It's very much human interacting with something, very front facing or front end, okay, and that. So that's a big thing is the front end, what the user sees, what the user manipulates to make the app do something. That. So to get into deeper components based on extension, right? Just so we like firmly understand what's going on, because we've been doing this, right? So we have this component like in OpenLayers and Leaflet in the Easter JavaScript API called the map, right? What is it? Right? It's a very fancy div. Now, I've seen other libraries where people don't use a div; they actually use the canvas to draw the map, CartoDB, to do some really fast display of like lots of data. They actually draw directly on the canvas, so they have a map or a layer like that is canvas based. A lot of the map controls that we work with, like I said, OpenLayers, Leaflet, ESRI, or ArcGIS, is just a div. It's a div, right? But it's fantastic stuff. You can pan and zoom and you can click on it and respond to events, right? But in the end, uh, find element by ID, and it's a div that you're hunting down. The accordion, it's a fancy div. So sometimes it's called accordion. I've seen it called other names for sure, but it's a concept where you can collapse an area. So it's a div that usually has a little, icon at the top for collapsing and expanding in that. And but basically, what are you doing? You're just changing the size of the div. Hey, you're this big now, and that to hide content. Trees are interesting. I mean, there is not a stock HTML tree control. There just isn't. Like in that, and tree views are all over the place. You see them in products like pgmin4 when they're showing you all the different things that are in the database, or you see it in Visual Studio Code when it's showing you all the files and directories in your project and the Explorer part of it and that. So tree controls are quite common in desktop applications and that. And so, but there really isn't a direct counterpart on the HTML side. So what I see is people using an ordered list. So ordered lists, they're in order like a tree is. You can often indent the list. So then it gets this noted feel to it, which then looks like a tree that there's indentation. So it's an easy one to pick to say, okay, we're going to take this ordered list thing, unordered list or ordered list in HTML and use it as the base for our fancy looking tree control in that. So so we see this happening in different libraries, and under the hood, this is how they're doing it, right? Side menu or drawer, again, it's a fancy div that, technically maybe when it starts out, its display is set to none, so it's not actually visible. It's there, right, in that, and then we can add things like shrinking the main page and giving it some room, and then adding an animation through Cascading Style Sheet so that it looks like it slides out from the left or slides up from the bottom in that. But that's all just fancy animation things. In the end, when you dig through it, oh, it's just a div with a bunch of stuff in it, right? That we turn the display on and off of. So especially any web mobile material design thing that you might see in a library like Quasar or Vuetify in that, is probably just taking existing HTML elements and just using them in a specific way and adding features either through JavaScript or cascading style sheets, right? So these are some great libraries to look at, component libraries that work with a framework called Vue, and that. And so you'll see where, okay, technically there isn't this fancy application top bar stock in HTML, but Vuetify is hooking into divs and other HTML elements underneath the hood, but present to you something that looks very much like a phone application. So the common collaborators, div, canvas, ordered list, I see those used a lot in that. It doesn't mean you can't use other tags, but I mean, div is king. I've said this probably before in lectures. The div is king. It's a little, rectangular or square area, and you get to do whatever you want in there. It's just like this portion of the page is the map, this portion of the page is the table, right? And it's true, you can turn the above into anything. So what you can do now is pause this video lecture and watch the demo on individual component. And so we'll take a look at a sort of like a slide out menu, or what some people would call a drawer if you're on Android. In that, but basically it's a tweaked example from W3 Schools. So what do I do now is talk about framework. Right, so component. The framework often deals with reactive data. Now there has to be a linkage, and it depends on the framework how this is done. Usually there are some properties that the component has that the framework is aware of, so they can change stuff, right? And that. So on the chart I've shown in previous demos, previous modules, where I change the data and tell the chart to update itself, right? So the link there is that the back end can come in and change the data of the chart. I just got to remember to tell the chart to, hey, redraw yourself, kind of stuff. So it's all about reactive data in that. So a big thing is binding stuff. So binding properties in the framework to properties in the components so that when the framework changes something, new data comes in from the server, that we update the component. So there's this binding thing. Hey, these properties on our component that the user interact with is tied to this, object or something in the background in JavaScript. And when they change, make sure the user sees the latest changes. Right? Now, how they do this, so you can update the DOM, Virtual Shadow Direct. There's lots of ways to do it. There's lots of frameworks based on Virtual DOM. Shadow is sort of the new thing, but I've seen optimizations in certain frameworks where it feels like they're almost doing what Shadow does, but it might have been the concept of Shadow didn't exist. I know the Vue framework, or Vite, actually Vite, when it does hot module replacement, is actively tracking what parts of the page don't change, so we don't have to worry about those, and what parts of the page do change, and those are the ones we're going to focus on. That's very Shadowish, right? Where you know ahead of time it's these parts that are changing, so we just have to hunt these nodes down and change them. Versus doing virtual, where you have a copy of the DOM and you make changes, and then you do what's called a diff, and then you know which nodes in the DOM that's loaded in the tab of a browser need to be changed. But there's nothing like what these frameworks do with Virtual DOM or Shadow DOM, right? There's nothing that any of these frameworks do that isn't already possible with what we call vanilla JavaScript, right? So because they are based on cascading style sheets and they are based on JavaScript, and if it can't be done there, right? What these frameworks offer you is that you don't have to write all the code to do it, right? But then you have to learn the framework. There's the trade-off, right? So nothing's for free and that kind of thing. Right? So when you do an update, it's the whole query the DOM thing. So if you know ahead of time, you kind of know the nodes you got to go to directly in that, or you had to do a diff comparison, right? In that. And so there's some time in, like, this is the thing. Who wins over time? Virtual versus Shadow versus direct, like who's faster kind of deal. And that's what it is. And it is a bit of a pay early, pay late thing. But like I said, I've seen people like Evan Yu over at Vue describe what they're doing with Vite and that, and how they're tracking changes of what parts of the document are changing. What, and I said, well, that's very Shadowish. So you may have the, performance-wise, you might be just as fast as Shadow if you're doing all those optimizations in the background for people. And that. Another thing is the state of an app. Early phone apps, or not just web ones, but just early phone apps in general. If you rotated the phone, you would say you were typing something and the phone rotated, you would lose your changes and that sort of thing. So that's like state information. Like what was the person typing in the text box? Don't lose that. So and what toggles do they turn off and on? Save that so that it's remembered the next time they use the app. So the state of the app, if an app allows you to check things on and off, turn things on and off, if it allows you to change colors and something like that, that's typically called state information of the app. And so you want to be able to preserve that. And so the backend frameworks like the UI control, that's not its job. It's to present to the user a visualization of the data in that. What was turned off and on, the framework usually handles that sort of stuff. Now, saving and restoring is interesting. Like when we get into these bigger frameworks and bigger platform as a service, you are designing an application and just saving all of it, all the things you added to an application besides its configuration and state information, you have to save that. But what if we were looking at an application like Draw.io or diagrams.net? Those allow you to draw a big technical diagram. Well, you need to be able to save that, right, to like Google Drive. And then you need to be able to bring that back from Google Drive to, if you need to edit the document. So that basic stuff of when you use an app where it helps you create content, well, you need to be able to save that content, bring it back, tweak it, change it. So there's a whole thing about saving and restoring, but it does your app do that, right? ArcGIS Collector lets you go out in the field and lets you collect points. It needs to be able to save them locally on the device, and when you open the app up again, it's got to go read those edits and show them to you on the screen. There's a whole other thing about syncing them back to the mothership. But that's what the frameworks do. They deal with all the underground plumbing about, data saving state. If you're capturing data, saving it, and then if it needs to be synced back to some web service, taking care of that. So the all the plumbing underneath that makes the app basically in that. So very JavaScript heavy, right? And it could be storing stuff in local remote databases and it's updating them. So it's taking care of all that stuff in that. And you're glad that the framework does that, because you wouldn't want to have to write all of that on your own, right? And so, but there's a trade-off. You got to learn the framework and you got to learn the workflow or the style of how they do stuff and adopt that style. Otherwise, you'll be fighting it the whole time. Right. So these are functions that most apps need: saving state, if you saving the objects that they're creating and restoring them. Is with a JavaScript app, web mobile app, then there's lots of DOM stuff that has to happen, right? And then binding objects, data sources in the back end to the controls in the front end, the data for your chart, that kind of stuff, the tiles for your map, right? That you want the back-end framework to handle all of that. So just to list off some popular frameworks that you can probably bump into. Vue is pretty popular. React is probably king right now, but Vue has a pretty big community, and they play very well with others, as we're going to see in that. Angular's been out there from Google. I guess we should Vue, Evan U. And that React would be out of the Facebook camp. Angular is out of the Google camp. There's also something called Lit, a new thing. Google has a philosophy, if anyone's going to disrupt your industry, it better be you. So, Google disrupting Angular in that. Angular's been around a while. It's gone through multiple versions. But Lit would be like the new way to do it with this new concept called, we'll call it web components, like, double, done. So there's this new thing coming around. It looks like it's going to stay in that. So right now it's been wild west on whatever some framework comes up to make components and make backends. It looks like they're adopting some of those principles I see in the frameworks and making it part of the HTML standard, that there will be a standard way to make a web component, interact with it, that sort of thing. And Lit, I think, because it's being actively developed at the time that this standard is coming in, it'll probably be the first one to just integrate to the standard quickly, and the other ones might adapt over time in that. Or they'll just put hooks in that, hey, we can handle our own components, or we can handle these new web components. No big deal for us. Got it all worked out, right? That's what will happen over time. But it's coming up with a more standard way, like there shall be a HTML tag called table, and so there shall be this thing called a web component. It will have this thing called a renderer, and it will render stock HTML. And so you can see they're borrowing a little bit from React, even on that, and a little bit from Vue in that. But that's only because I know these frameworks a little bit in that. But that's where we're heading to. They're in the future, there might be a standard way to do this, and so you could learn the standard way. You don't have to learn go from Vue to React to Angular and go, wow, do these sure do things so differently. This is like tough trying to keep all three of these in your head. But having a more standard way to do web components. Now, it might get traction, it might not, right? I've seen this before. A really good looking technology in your head, you say, well, that solves a lot of problems. Like that should, that's like golden. But then it doesn't get adopted for whatever reason, right? It could be physics, inertia. There's too many bought into these other frameworks that they can't move off of them. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It's promising, but I've seen lots of promising technology just not get traction, right? And by that I mean adoption, right? And so looks like it could work in that. Will it replace these? No. What I feel is that these frameworks will build some hooks so that they can work with any type of components. I mean, we're going to see Vue is already working with a whole bunch of component libraries. Stock web components will just be another one, right? And that sort of thing. Svelte is another very popular framework as well in that. I should probably put it above Lit. These aren't in any kind of order. These are just the ones I know off the top of my head. And there's always the Vue, React, Angular, but I'll give some props to Svelte and Lit as well in that. And so this gets us to the topic of a framework ecosystem, right? Uh, the app ecosystem from Apple, the app ecosystem from Google. These are big development camps and stuff. And there's definitely certain frameworks have big ecosystems. Okay, and so big communities, which means uh, when you're learning the framework, it's easy to get help because there's lots of people out there willing to help you in that. Okay, the big however, yes, the big however, components based on a framework, right? So I already talked about like views of framework, but really, I mean, they're really focused on the reactivity part, the DOM part, making that as fast as possible, clean as possible, stable as possible. So, you know, are they going to build a bunch of components? They're like, we're really busy over here. We'll stay with the reactivity part, but we'll put all this stuff in so you can just drop your components in for sure. In that, and so there's many modern frameworks have something called a template or a renderer, right? So I see this. What it was, it's interesting because there were these Polymer web components from Google that looked really good. So, pre-built login dialog and uh, uh, all these other different controls. And now the Lit is replacing Polymer. But, in all honesty, all the pre-built controls aren't there. They would have to rewrite the pre-built controls more in this web component style and that. But all of these frameworks, React, Vue, they have a way of you templating a component and then or you might see the word renderer. This is how we render the component, or you might even see a function like React called renderer in that. And so that's the hook in. So the hooks are there for you to build your own components. So you as a developer, you can build components that don't exist yet. But the reality is, we as JS people, we come in a level above that. I don't want to build my own components because I got to get this done by 3:30 or Friday or something like that. I need to grab some existing components. Like I don't want to build my own leaflet. I just want to drop leaflet in. I don't want to build my own charting component. I just want to use chart.js and stuff like that. So what a JS person is looking for, right, are pre-built components in that. All these frameworks, React, Vue, Angular, have the ability for you to create your own components. So if you were the person who is going to make Leaflet, or you're going to be the person who makes Chart.js, so you can have your own web components, and then other people can use those. But we usually fall into the camp of other people that use those, right? So I don't want to make my own calendar widget. I want to find a really cool one and use it, that sort of thing. But all the frameworks have this built in so that people can build component libraries that we, as JS people building web apps or web mobile apps, want to use, right? Right. So basically, ends up being a JavaScript class that knows how to render itself on screen. Fundamentally, it's part of built into the framework. They have the building blocks to make your own components. So there's often the framework like Vue, Angular, React take care of the reactivity part, making sure the data gets changed, and that. But the responsive part is usually part of the person who builds this custom component that didn't exist before, right? And that. But it depends on the framework how that actually plays out and what happens. Okay. And like I said, often you want pre-built components that you can just start using. Like, I don't want to build my own map component. I just got to figure out Leaflet, OpenLayers, or ESRI, right? They've got a map component. I'm going to use theirs, kind of stuff. So I think the framework ecosystem level, right, is where we want to be. Yeah, we might be using Vue, but we're also going to go over here and look at Vuetify and all these other ones and use all their stuff because it looks really good, right? So this is just a Vue framework, okay? So this happens on possibly on every other framework. So the permutation combinations just gets wildly out of control quickly. Okay, so there's something called Bootstrap Vue. So we've done some Bootstrap stuff because Bootstrap is the front end, front-facing stuff. And then Vue is the back-end reactivity part. So we get this combo of responsive and reactive together, right? But who's doing what, right? And there's a nice separation of concerns there. And that's typically what you want. Vue says, yeah, we can work with Bootstrap, no problem, right? And there's Quasar. Yeah, we'll work with Quasar. And there's Vuetify, and they focus on material design, right? And that I should note that Quasar has a little bit of material design too, okay? In that, but Vuetify is like, if I'm honest about it, they're really dialed in and they nailed some of it, right? It really looks like they really stuck to the guide. Material Design is a design guide for Android apps, if you're curious. And so they have a whole bunch of stuff about how elevated your button should look, and animations about how things comes into the screen, and yeah, it goes on and on in that. So Vuetify really nailed it. There's Vuetify, Bulma. It's based on the Bulma sort of like CSS framework. So those are user controls. They slide into Vue in that. There's Core UI, Vue Material. Again, Material Design pops up. I might tag the Quasar one with Material Design. You're going to see it show up a lot in that. Why is this so important? It's the web mobile area. It's a huge development area, and people want their apps to look like Gmail and to look like all these other apps, so they kind of like fit in. They don't look like an oddball on your mobile device. Vue SAX, iView, Vue Material Kit. There's Material Design again, right? All over the place. Wait, there's more. Yes, right. This is only the top 14. There's more than this just for Vue times all the other frameworks, right? Prime Vue, Element, Keen Vue, Mint UI. It's just all these component libraries. And again, some of these some of them are strictly built for Vue, but some of these other component libraries will slide into the other frameworks too. In that, and so you can mix and match. Hey, I like the way React does something, or I like the way Vue does something, but I really like how this cascading style sheet component looks. Can I have the best of both worlds? Yes, in some cases you can. Tailwind. Oh, I can't believe. Yeah, Tailwind's a really good one too. Looks good. It's interesting. Like, yeah, I think it's Tailwind. The author goes over like their experience with cascading style sheets and how they get out of control quickly, and how they're like, okay, this is nuts. I got to build my own thing because just to save their sanity in that. But yeah, Tailwind can slide in, right? And again, that was just some, not all, some for the Vue framework, and then we could do that for all the other frameworks, the combos and that. And so this is not is it a good or bad thing? Yeah, lots of choices. Sometimes, too many. Some people are like, what do I do? What do I do? Right? Or they worry about, what if I pick the wrong one? Well, the big thing is to pick one and get started and that. Figure out if it's the wrong one later and that. And that's a relative term about whether something's right or wrong. So that's the big thing. It might have been the right decision at the time, but things change, and if you had better information, you might have picked something different. Thing is to get in there, try at least a couple. Like, go look at their controls, see if yeah, actually that looks pretty good. That's what I want. And then you got to carve out some time to actually play around. It wouldn't hurt to have like a very simple app that you build in different frameworks and with different component libraries, and then you can really get a feel for, okay, don't make the app too big or too complicated, but just like, okay, I got this to-do list. I think or I got this mapping app with a chart. So how hard was it to do in Vue, and how hard was it to do in React in that? But remember, my thing is, a lot of these frameworks are being pitched at developers to make controls that we would use. Where we're coming in is I already want the pre-built control. So some of the stuff you'll see in a framework may not apply to us. We might be able to cobble together enough controls from an existing UI framework, and Vue just happens to be the back end, or React happens to be the back end. Okay. So what you can do now is pause this video lecture and watch the demo on Vuetify. Now, we're not going to code. We're just going to go look at some of their controls, and then you have to make a decision. Is that what I want, right? Or is that what I want my app to look like?